Welcome back to another episode. Today's guest is Matthias Muehlbauer, founding partner of OnePointFive. OnePointFive helps organizations and individuals implement and integrate sustainability across the board in their strategy, operations, and career choices. In this episode, we talk about OnePointFive's work to build the climate workforce of the future. We also learn about Matthias's professional journey to working at the intersection of climate and business, covering topics such as ESG, corporate sustainability, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, net zero, carbon markets, and more. So please enjoy my conversation with Matthias on decarbonizing business and the climate workforce of the future. Welcome, Matthias. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the episode.
Yeah, can you share a little bit about what you do in the climate space right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a co-founder and founding partner of OnePointFive. We are a climate advisory based in New York. We also do training. Let me explain those two hats. On the climate advisory side, we work with multinational organizations across the US, EU, and APAC to help them decarbonize their strategy and operations. What this looks like is measuring their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, building out decarbonization plans and climate strategies. We also work with investment funds to help build their climate investment strategies and support their portfolio companies to help them decarbonize as well. And then the other hat that we have is the training and education side. So we have something called the 1.5 Academy, which is an 8-week cohort-based accelerator for sustainability professionals, all around getting to net zero, start to finish. And so we talk about topics like measuring your emission, setting your net zero targets, building your sustainability reports, and also building a decarbonization plan to help you implement your decarb dreams and aspirations as well. We launched it in February last year in 2023. And since we've had 5 cohorts with around 700 to 800 people graduating into our community, of which Kiana is one of those wonderful graduates from the 1.5 Academy as well. So that's a little bit of background of what we do. We've really gone from a bedroom consulting outfit to a midtown office, 17 people working for the organization, and a huge community of global climate leaders as well over the past 4 years. So yeah, happy to talk a little bit more about what we do as the conversation goes.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations on all that you've accomplished with 1.5 in such a short time. My familiarity with the work you're doing and others who've gone through the program is that you're really inspiring many people and touching their lives and contributing to a lot of really important transformation. So thank you for that work, and here for the
So much.
decarbonization dreams, because we have a lot of them. Can
Absolutely.
you share a little bit briefly about what inspired you to work at this intersection of climate, decarbonization, and business?
Yeah, so maybe I can share a little bit of my story, and there's a little bit of a villain origin story as well, which a lot of people have in the climate space. So I originally am from Australia. That's where the accent's from, and essentially started my career at PwC, initially as an auditor, so an accountant, and then I moved into consulting, and consulting was around M&A strategy and also operations consulting as well. And it was the time of the resource sector consolidation in Australia. So we saw a lot of oil and gas and mining companies that were consolidating over that period of time. And I worked on quite a lot of projects where we were working through M&A diligence and looking at how these companies look in the future. And that included a lot of what you call cost transformations in the consulting business, which includes quite a lot of layoffs. And so whilst I was getting some fantastic professional experience, I had really wanted to figure out, what else is out there to create an impactful career, as I felt quite disenchanted with the type of work that I was doing. I had this amazing opportunity to do an MBA in Tokyo. I was given this opportunity to complete a 1-year MBA at Japan's oldest commerce university, and it was completely funded by the Japanese government, and they'd actually paid the study. So I would have been crazy to not take that opportunity. And I also got this opportunity to do a second year at Yale School of Management, which brought me over to the US. Throughout that time, I was really looking at what is the type of impactful career that I want to find, and how do I want to find purpose within that career. And I kept on circling back to climate. In October 2018, the IPCC released this landmark report on the climate sort of state of play at the time. And this is the thing that really shocked me into action. And I think a lot of people in the space have also had a similar experience. Essentially, the headlines were something like, we have 12 years to solve climate change. And, I'd seen things like in January 2020, back in Australia, the incredible bushfires that decimated, I think, up to like 1 billion sort of wildlife, including, a huge chunk of our koala population. I'd spent, I think I was 18 at the time. I went scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef, and it had this incredible marine life that I'd never seen before. And, we've gone through, I think it's 6 bleaching events since. And so I saw this incredible need to do something about it and use some of the experiences and expertise that I've built from a career in consulting and that I picked up at business school to focus my efforts into climate. And so when I came to the US, I had the opportunity to take subjects at the Yale School of Environment. I met a lot of climate folk there, and actually started working at Cambium Carbon. And they were actually dreaming these huge plans to essentially rewire the supply chains of the urban wood space. Essentially, they repurposed waste wood streams that come from felled trees in cities, and they would redistribute these waste streams into urban mills, and they would then upcycle these goods into things like furniture and fitting, cutting boards, and they've actually been incredibly successful. They were just on the July 4th, I think NBC special showing off American innovation. They won a bunch of awards, but it was the first time that I was able to use a lot of the financial skills that I've built in consulting. And I was actually building a tree model, essentially to work out how many trees were going into this model, how could they be converted into opportunities for revenue, and then how could a portion of that revenue be funded into replanting trees and helping reforest American cities. And this was the first opportunity for me to actually see that I could use my existing skill sets to work in climate. At the same time at Yale, I had met my co-founder, Neil, at an Australian bushfire event. And it's a strange place to meet, but we essentially hit it off and started working together. I moved to New York in the summer of August 2020, which of course was a crazy time with the pandemic. I couldn't actually get home. I was stranded in the US. Flights had gone through the roof. Our national airline, Qantas, the one with the kangaroo logo on the planes, had actually shuttered essentially all their flights. They parked all their planes into the desert. And as a result, flights were something crazy. Like a one-way ticket was $20,000, $30,000 to get home. So in the midst of this kind of crazy time that, everyone went through at that, the COVID era, I suppose, I started building OnePointFive. And I could see a connection between being able to use my skill sets and find great purpose in building a climate organization as well. So that's a little bit of my Dylan origin story. And of course, there's a lot more in details that we can go into further.
That's super interesting, though, to see how I can see the threads of what you're doing now is informed by the different things you've done that led you to, founding OnePointFive. And also, I'm sure there's the global perspective as well of is always super helpful because this is a global issue, right? And especially in thinking about supply chains and emissions that, crosses the globe. So just really interesting. And on a personal note, I definitely remember I had a very close friend living in Australia during the pandemic, and that was really rough with essentially the borders were basically
crazy.
closed. It was
Right.
terrible. And In 2018, I got to scuba dive in the Barrier Reef, and which was the only time I've done that, but I could see so much coral bleaching. So that was definitely an intense moment for me too, to be able to see that firsthand.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Right. And
So
I guess just on that, I think it's really fascinating. I think the people that have worked in climate, whilst there's, I guess, this huge feeling of existentialism and loss, I think there's so much uh, incredible work that can be done by focusing on the solutions and feeling like you have some pulse on action. And I think that does play into a lot of building the right mindset when you're working in climate, as it is really difficult. It can be soul destroying. But I think thinking about, having a solutions focus is one of the most important things that you can do to actually continue persevering amidst all this really tough work, as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about other things that are helpful in being resilient and working in this space.
thank you for saying that. I 100% agree. And it's how do we hold the loss and the joy at the same time, because we are experiencing a lot of loss and will continue to do so as we're locked into certain amounts of warming, planetary warming. And at the same time, there is, I think, so much energy and excitement in the solutions and so much room for really exciting innovation, like the work you were describing with the trees and much of the work you're doing now. So before we dive even further into the many solutions you're working on, just to give a little bit of industry background, can you just explain a little bit about kind of what is corporate sustainability and ESG, and why is it so crucial to the future of how we have, sustainable businesses?
Yeah, I'm happy to. When I give this explanation, and there's probably many different explanations out there, it's still like a pretty new, I guess you call it like a management paradigm. Um, but let me just set the table a little bit. So corporate sustainability is really like an emerging form of corporate management, which looks at economic growth of companies through sustainability. It's intended to consider not just economic, but also ethical, social, environmental, and cultural dimensions of doing business. And so this also kind of links into ESG, which is just a sort of bucket of that, usually used in a financial context when you look at like ESG investment. Of course, that relates to environmental, social, and governance. At OnePointFive, we really look at corporate sustainability from this lens of getting to net zero, right? And this is at the global level. What this means is, our approach to reducing emissions by 45% by 2030 and getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And this can be translated into the company level as well. Companies have a set of similar timelines that we need to get to in order to really get to this trajectory of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this pathway beyond this 1.5 degrees threshold, we get into quite a bit of trouble. For example, we're talking about the Great Barrier Reef will actually lose something like 90% of marine life if we get to 2 degrees Celsius. And so this also connects to 1.5 and the specific name we have as well. And just so you know, and you can hold me to this as this will be recorded, we won't change the name of 1.5 if we do go over 1.5 degrees. And if in that world, we will still aspirationally be working towards getting things to 1.5 degrees.
Right. Well, that it reminds me of like the organization 350, right? Parts per
Yeah.
million. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean we've
exactly.
surpassed that. But I
Right.
think even, I mean, hopefully, obviously you hold that aspiration, but I think even if it does go beyond that, there's still a lot of power and symbolism in the name of what it represents. So yeah, I think it's a great name. Um, can you briefly explain the I know this wasn't in the questions, I'm just bringing this up. Can you briefly explain the difference between single materiality and double materiality when we're thinking about the impact of businesses?
Yeah, sure, sure. So single materiality versus double materiality is, I guess, an approach to how companies are reporting on their sustainability. And it takes into account a different number of stakeholders. So for single materiality, this is where you're considering the impact of the climate onto your business, right? And double materiality is the inverse. So the impact of your business onto the climate. And so this actually ties to a few different reporting standards that are out there. So you might be familiar with something called the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, and they focus on double materiality. So they're considering both actions both ways, right? And this is a way to take into account a more holistic understanding of the true impact of organizations. And you can point to some specific ratings that come from, for example, MSCI. They actually use a single materiality rating in order to rate their organizations. And so you could have an organization that we know has gigantic impacts on the environment and a range of stakeholders, but they could have a really high score. It's because they're taking into account single materiality here. Now, double materiality is used in GRI, but it's also used in the EU CSRD. And so the intention is to create this holistic impact to disclose how organizations are impacting, not just they're being impacted by the environment from a climate risk perspective, for example, but also how they are impacting from the amount of emissions that they release, the biodiversity impacts that they have. And this is a much more holistic way of considering it. The ICSB uses single materiality, and I know that I'm mentioning quite a lot of sort of what we call the alphabet soup of regulatory standards here. That's kind of part of the problem. We have a lot of standards out there, and it's really difficult to know what to do as an organization and to navigate between all the sort of competing standards out there. There's like an adage out there that there's always a body that's trying to standardize and integrate all of the standards together, and then all they do is just make the problem worse. They create another standard people need to follow, but that interoperability is still important. And so the reason that the ISSB, and so this is the organization that has integrated with the largest accounting framework out there, IFRS. What they're trying to do is to help scale a form of climate reporting. And so they're using single materiality, and they're expecting them to add on additions to that. So you can add on, GRI, for example, you can add on double materiality. Thinking about taking baby steps, if we're trying to get everyone under the same regulatory regime, and having to get jurisdictions to adopt this from a legal perspective, it's easier to start easy and continue to ramp up as well. And this is the way that they see it from the ISSB's perspective. Emmanuel Faber, the lead of ISSB, this is his response when people talk about single materiality versus double materiality and why they haven't included it. It's thinking about how can we quickly scale this, and then once we have all the jurisdictions in the world that cover all our greenhouse gas emissions, we can then start ratcheting up the additional requirements for reporting, for example.
It's super mind-boggling to me that you could have a company that has massive environmental impact, and then they're scoring high on these metrics, which is just measuring the impact of the environment on the company. And I think, especially when we're thinking about the fact that, these few huge companies are so largely responsible for massive amounts of global emissions. So I just think it's really fascinating kind of the way that what is considered standard reporting metrics sort of skews the interpretation of like what's actually happening, right? Because I think in 1.5 Academy, I know we talked about this, but the greenwashing that can occur in a lot of corporate sustainability reports, and kind of what metrics are included, what metrics are not, and like what's actually happening. So I think it's a very interesting area, as it's really important that we have better, more standardized, more transparent reporting metrics, because this is so vital to all of our well-being on the planet and for businesses to be viable to continue to operate, right? As conditions are changing with climate change that affects every level. Um,
Right, right. And
yeah,
I think the challenging part here is how do you scale a system
right.
quickly so it has impact? And I think there's this tension between scaling something for impact and getting it right. And I think a lot of the issues that we have in the climate space are tied to these two sort of opposing forces. The SEC is a great example of this as well. They're looking to essentially set up mandatory reporting for public companies in the US. And now it's stuck in litigation. We have one side that's saying they're not doing enough, and then the other side saying they're doing too much. And so, how do you match this, or how do you balance the right level of uh, substance and be able to scale, knowing that there's probably things that you left on the table? And I think about this a lot when I think about policy that's out there. What was left off the table in order for it to get through? And there's an adage in I guess the tech world, which is like focus on getting it done, not perfect, right? Let the I guess it's good be the enemy of perfect. Another way to say it. And yeah, I think a lot of people will die on certain hills along that spectrum. I think that also is important, but we still need to have this tension between both poles, and hopefully together we can then come to a consensus that drives us in a positive trend that gets us to where we need to get to. I think there's the dead weight loss that is the concern. Who doesn't come along during that period of time? What additional parts per million do we have to experience? And what kind of delays do we have before we actually get to the action that we need to solve climate?
Absolutely. And, some companies do genuinely care and are very much trying, and other companies wouldn't be making changes and moving forward on this without having regulation and policy and reporting standards that they're required to fulfill. And so that's why it's very important that the standards continue to evolve in a way that is pushing companies to do better and like truly decarbonize on every level. Um, yeah. So with that said, um, this decarbonization, it's not going to happen on its own. We need lots of passionate, talented people to make this work happen. And you are contributing to that with 1.5 Academy. So can you share a little bit about what inspired you to start this program and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So, um, let me tell you a little bit of a story of how we first started. So, 1.5 started on this essential initial hypothesis in that right right now, generalist consulting is broken and cannot give us the solutions we need to solve climate. Why is this the case? Well, the generalist consulting model is really set up in a way that science consultants that are on the bench, that are free, they're available and they then are placed onto projects. And essentially they're great with logic. They have compelling storytelling, but they're not so great at identifying solutions that can really be implemented, right? Especially when it comes to niche areas. And certainly this is important for thinking about climate when they require such interdisciplinary ways of solving solutions. So we have this idea of bringing what we call an expert network to life to integrate into our projects. So we had something like 140 climate experts from around the world working on projects on the side of their desk, almost like a Fiverr or an Upwork for climate, or an internalized GLG expert network model. And so we got to around 140 experts or so, and we found that we actually had this huge bottleneck in our business model. And it was actually on generating projects on the OPS side. So to solve this, we actually tried to bring in more experts to propose a project together and see how this working group would go. And we realized that our experts were actually missing some fundamental skills that we would use in day-to-day sustainability consulting. And so we actually identified our own, I guess, the sustainability skills gap from this model. And so we thought, how can we actually embed these climate skills, I guess commercial skills as well, that we use every day through training? And also, why don't we make this available, not just to our expert network, but to everybody? I actually remember writing the phrase 1.5 Academy on the whiteboard, one brainstorming session. And I guess that was the birth of the Academy. And I guess fast forward to where we are now, we've just done, I guess, 5 cohorts across, I think it's something like 50 different countries we've had people graduate from, which is incredible. And yeah, it seems to have really hit a real pain point in the market, especially for job seekers, especially people that are wanting to get into sustainability consulting, people that are wanting to build a Swiss Army knife of sustainability skills, and for people that are wanting to really drive change within the corporate sustainability space.
That's fantastic, and that you're reaching people across so many countries. When I'm thinking about, like, equitable climate solutions, it's not just, like, what are the outcomes and impacts, but who has access to contributing to climate solutions. So I think having programs that are really accessible for people who want to get into this work or transition their career, is really important, and I think your program is doing that. So can you share some of the you mentioned the skills gap that's occurring, and just the need for, more people who are equipped to take on climate jobs. So can you share a little bit about what some of the essential skills are that we need in our growing sustainability workforce and how you are, teaching them and upskilling people through this program?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think we can definitely share a little bit of the work that we're doing on this white paper called The Climate Workforce of the Future. And this is a working title at the moment, so this could change. And essentially it started at COP28 in Dubai, where I hosted 2 events on the topic of the climate workforce of the future. It turns out that this topic on green skills and the sustainability gap has become super, super loud. And it makes sense. A lot of companies have made commitments and pledges, but they're struggling to get to action. And so there is a notable sustainability skills gap that is preventing us from actually implementing all these strategies. So the last 6 months, we've actually spent about, I don't know how many hours we've spent on it, but we have been interviewing a lot of sustainability leaders in this space to get the latest on this topic. And so this ties definitely to our 1.5 Academy course, which we've built something called the 1.5 pathway, which highlights essentially the life cycle of an organization as they go through sustainability, right? And this would bring in setting a net zero target, usually using some sort of framework like the Science Based Targets Initiative, measuring your emissions from scope 1, 2, 3 at the enterprise level, and then also measuring it from a product level as well. So looking at your life cycle assessment to understand the impacts of your product from, for example, carbon emissions, but also toxicity, carcinogens, right? And these skills are incredibly important in terms of building literacy for people to understand. How do you integrate climate into your organization? What are the impacts, and therefore what are the changes that you can make to reduce your footprint? At the same time, we also teach on sustainability reporting, how to build decarbonization plans as well. And then some of the key, Swiss Army knife consulting skills that are required in sustainability as well. And this includes, your soft skills that you're needing. And so, tying together these skills that we're building in the academy, and then tying the work and research that we're doing on the climate workforce of the future, we see that from leaders like folk from Salesforce, ECG, Department of Energy. I know you've spoken to someone from the Department of Energy in the last season. The other folk from LinkedIn, Nordstrom, Etsy, Levi's. We wanted to understand how they actually activating the climate workforce of the future. And some interesting, perhaps counterintuitive ideas that we heard from this research. contrary to what we think, every job is not a climate job. And interestingly, I think that is something that we've heard from Project Drawdown, and they created this framework, but it's actually a slightly different nuance that we're starting to see, and I think this makes sense when we hear this fact out here that there's a million climate jobs out there, right? But we consistently see climate job seekers struggle to find jobs. And so actually there's a few things happening here. We have individuals that require a subset of sustainability skills, but they have existing capabilities. So for example, we have people that are in the supply chain, for example, and they've got 10 to 15 years of working in the complexities of the supply chain, getting really deep in understanding how the stakeholders work, understanding how the complex processes work, and how to really build consensus in that really difficult, often collaborative part of a company's value chain. But we see that they need to have what we call a sustainability minor. So they need to understand what is scope 1, 2, and 3. How can we electrify our fleets, for example? Would you like me to explain?
Yeah, for those who don't know, just very briefly what the difference between scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, what is scope 1, 2, and 3 anyway? It's a great question. And let me just set the table here. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are a way to categorize a company's emissions inventory, we call it. And they're split into 3 different categories. From scope 1 all the way to scope 3, they actually become more difficult to measure and calculate, and you have less ability to control these emissions as well. So scope 1 is really the direct emissions from your own facilities as well as your vehicles. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from the generation of things like purchased energy, steam, heat, and cooling. And then we have scope 3, and this is the indirect emissions occurring upstream a value chain or downstream the company's value chain, right? And so supply chain is incredibly important because this involves scope 3. Majority of an organization's emissions are in scope 3, right? And so as a result, in order for us to get to climate action and be able to meet these net zero targets that we're trying to hit, we need to focus a lot on this scope 3, which requires a lot of complex supply chain activity. Now, bringing this back to why we need specific skills within an organization, for supply chain experts, they're likely not to have this level of climate literacy around technical skills, around scope 1, 2, and 3. But what we're seeing and how the hiring market is playing out is that a lot of folk are focusing on what we call the sustainability unicorn, right? And it's almost like dream list of an individual, right? They have like 10 years of academic experience in sustainability. They have 10 years in industry experience. They are so rare and they're incredibly expensive. And they are essentially what hirers are looking for, employers are looking for. What we see out there is that that's not going to help us get to net zero. We have a huge amount of interest and enthusiasm and passion and skills out there from job seekers, but they don't need to be a sustainability unicorn. They can be a supply chain expert with 10 years of experience and they're looking to pivot into climate. They're able to upskill on technical skills like scope 1, 2, and 3, almost building a sustainability minor onto their supply chain major. And this is where every job is a climate job sort of gets a little bit murky because it's about the nuance. It's probably a gradient. So not everybody's job will be a full climate job, but there'll likely be different shades of green, different necessity for green skills in order for them to do the work that they're doing.
It's an interesting point in that this industry is so new in many ways that, as you said, there's not a lot of people that have years and years of experience. So employers need to have the flexibility to train people who are transitioning from other industries, because that's where a lot of the climate workforce of the future is going to come from, people who are in other industries now, right? And also the space is rapidly evolving, which I think is really interesting, to be in a space that's like changing and growing so constantly, because there's always more to learn, and always an opportunity to kind of shift strategy and approaches and find new things that work. So I actually find that exciting in many ways. But speaking of things that are murky, we've been talking about net zero. As you were speaking, I thought of this. We've been chatting about net zero, and which doesn't mean that you have zero emissions, but that through things like carbon offsets, right, and other mechanisms such as that your emissions are totaling to zero. I feel like carbon offsets are a tricky area. I mentioned greenwashing before. And I think a lot of times there is greenwashing when it comes to carbon offsets, because they're relying on, say, indigenous lands, or other lands where the monitoring is questionable, or companies are doing, complex things. That said, I guess, how do we, because you're deep in the work of working with companies on decarbonization, like, as just a consumer, and someone wanting to make sustainable choices, how do we know that companies are that the claims they're making are, that there's validity to them, and that these net zero claims, I think everyone has seen a net zero claim that has made you scratch your head, or like a
Mm,
target, right?
sure,
Like, how
sure.
how do we vet what net zero is truly impactful, and what net zero claims are greenwashing with questionable carbon offsets or other things? Because it's something I am trying to navigate as a consumer in this
Mm.
world. Yeah.
I mean, it's a spicy question, for sure. So I'm glad you brought it up. I think the headline is there's no silver bullet to identifying greenwashing, but there's things that you can focus on to make sure or maximize the likelihood that it's not happening. And I'm going to approach this from perhaps like a global perspective. So we need to have different pressures that are helping set up carbon offsets and the carbon offset market and the intentions behind it in the best way possible. Now, one way is through regulation, right? So we can have greenwashing regulations out there that help to determine what is okay versus not okay in terms of disclosing the story around your products and services and your organizational activities. You can also have key assurance bodies, right? Verifiers, and also guidance and frameworks that allow people to make better decisions when they're purchasing carbon offsets, right? And this is kind of tied to this fact that at the moment, the voluntary carbon market is around $2 billion, right? It has a huge amount that it could grow to, right? There's numbers out there, I think, from Bloomberg that it could grow by 35 times. And, that makes a lot of sense because the ability for trees, for example, to sequester carbon is an existing technology that works. If we are avoiding deforestation, this is a type of carbon offset that's available out there, a carbon credit. We are using technology that's already out there. We're stewarding the forest that we have, and we're trying to change this economic relationship where trees are worth more cut down than they are to stay in the ground. And so I guess that initial idea is what people are trying to do with setting up these carbon markets. The issue is it's so nascent at the moment. It's like the wild, wild west. And so in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of controversy where people have had the wrong incentives, right? Actors are incentivized to make their numbers murky because they get paid if they make their numbers higher. There's a lack of governance from a global perspective. There's a lack of an overarching regulatory regime globally that makes bad actors behave, the externality is not actually captured. And so we've had integrity as, I guess, the hot word of probably 2023, where we've had guidance from ICVCM and VCMI, two bodies that are helping with essentially building better guidelines on how you should actually approach this carbon offsets from a corporate perspective. And so this is similar to when you have technology that's brand new, and at the beginning it's like the Wild Wild West. There's limited regulation, so actors can do whatever they want, and they're going to just follow what they're incentivized to do. This is a similar type of situation with carbon offsets. We're still in the nascent parts of the market. And so similar to technology, as it gets adopted and scaled, we then add in regulations which inhibit and realigns incentives to make sure that we are reducing the bad outcomes and maximizing the good outcomes. So I see this as a work in progress. It needs to happen faster, as a lot of this climate action requires, but it's getting on the right track in that we are starting to get global consensus on how we should best integrate how to purchase carbon offsets of credits in the right way, such that it reflects the underlying substance of this activity.
Absolutely. I mean, renewable energy credits have, I would say, more regulation, but carbon markets have sort of been in limbo for a long time, where you think there's progress being made on cap and trade. And there's still a lot to be worked out. So I'm curious to see how that continues to evolve, as the demand for carbon offsets is just going to expand and expand in the coming years. Yeah. So let's talk about this 100K for 2030 initiative that you are doing at OnePointFive.
Yeah, absolutely. So we realize there's this huge sustainability skills gap that we have. And part of this is requiring a huge effort in terms of the climate workforce in the future. And so we have this ambition to train and activate 100,000 sustainability professionals for 2030. Currently, we're at about 1,300, but we have plans to ramp up with various partners. Now, this is really tied into the fact that we have these 2030 emissions targets set, but right now we're probably on track to miss them, with certainly huge consequences for everyone on the planet. And as a result, we see this incredible opportunity for us to close this sustainability skills gap. I think LinkedIn has this great green skills reports. As of last year, the last 5 years before that, we saw job postings requiring green skills growing at 8% annually over the past 5 years. At the same time, the share of green talent had grown at roughly 6% annually in the same period. Huge gap. And in the same report that they released a year later, we saw last year this gap increased, with green skills demand growing 22% and green talent growing only 12%. And so we see this gap can either be filled internally or externally, for example, by consultants, given the lack of time we have to address the climate. And we see that education and training are the pathway to impactful climate solutions. I think this also takes into account how we can also give access to people around the world as well that need this climate literacy. There's a great example of an interview that we had with an individual from Kumasi, Ghana. So Kumasi has the second largest rainforest in the region. And this candidate that I was talking to was talking about how they didn't have access to understanding how to learn about GHG accounting, scope 1, 2, and 3, the carbon credit value chain, understanding corporate sustainability net zero. At the same time, on his doorstep was Vera and Gold Standard, the two gigantic verifiers that are actually verifying carbon projects in the world, right? And so climate is such a localized but global issue, and the solutions need to reflect that as well. And so we believe that focusing on 100,000 sustainability professionals for 2030 will allow us to permeate this literacy of skills that's required in this space in order for us to drive action at this global level, but also from these little nodes of local action too. And education is one of the most amazing things that can empower people to do it themselves and drive impact from that perspective. And so 100,000 is a gigantic number. For us, it's hugely ambitious, but we have to be ambitious to get to 2030. We absolutely have to. And so we're excited to continue the work, and we know that we have a lot of hockey stick growth to make that happen. at the same time, we're super excited to see that huge impact that's going to create impact across the globe.
It's exciting to hear your vision for expanding this and reaching so many people, and like the story you just shared, how that impact is different and the challenges people are facing in their local communities, and addressing those solutions does really have global impact. Because I'm continually so inspired by all the different local solutions that I'm seeing. So really wonderful to have that goal and have big decarbonization dreams. And I'm excited for you and the
Yeah.
program.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
think another beautiful result of this work you're doing is the creation of a sense of community between, I think, people who go through the program. So, um, yeah, I think when I'm kind of thinking about climate work and a more equitable climate future, I think a lot of this work has to have joy and community in it to sustain us. So I'd love to know, like, what's bringing you joy in your work and how you see joy as being essential to make this work happen in communities.
Yeah. I'm glad you bring up this specific emotion and aspect into into this interview. I think a lot of people forget to be happy and be joyful in this work. And I think that's incredibly hard because climate work is hard. It's tough. I often feel overwhelmed and certainly burnt out from the work that we do. But what keeps me going is the joy of bringing others along the journey and seeing how powerful a community can be in driving impact. And this could be through, stories of personal success, getting climate jobs, seeing people in positions of power where they can leverage their climate knowledge to help shape a future that will look after generations after us and leave a lasting legacy. I think another thing that inspires me and brings joy to my work is that I work with the most brilliant people at OnePointFive. We have a super flat structure, which means that anyone can provide feedback and radical candor to make sure that the best idea floats to the top in all the work we do. And I would just say I left Australia as I wanted to build something meaningful with individuals that want to both make a difference, but are also incredibly motivated and the best at what they do. And I kind of get to do that every day at OnePointFive. And that the people part really gives me joy.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I relate to that. People bring me joy too. So many wonderful people in this work. So
Yeah.
wonderful.
Amazing.
Okay.
Well,
Um,
thank you so much for having me join the podcast. I love the work you're doing. Of course, you are in that 100,000 goal that we have as you've gone through the academy. And we were just so excited to see where you go in your career and the impact that you are making right now and the future impact that you certainly will have. And I hope this podcast creates some incredible waves in the climate space and beyond. So thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. That was so sweet. Thank you for being here and just
This
for
was fun.
sharing your insights. I feel like I could keep talking about all these topics. I already have more more things I want to chat about. So to be continued, hopefully. Perhaps. And thank you for just your insights and all the incredible, impactful work you're doing. So yes, thanks, Matthias.
And to you. Thanks so much, Kiana.